And welcome back to the HE Enabled podcast. This is the show all about sharing our experiences of disability, neurodivergence, and long-term health conditions in the UK higher education system. I'm Kath, and this week I am joined by Kelly, a much anticipated guest for me. I've been really looking forward to this one. She is a programme manager at the London School of Economics and Political Sciences, typically known as LSE, because that is a long university name, where I know her best for managing the Laidlaw Scholars programme. Hopefully we get to talk a little bit about it later. Kelly works incredibly hard, both on developing inclusive experiences for the scholars and making sure that they turn into ethical leaders themselves. She also holds degrees from the University of Greenwich and Kingston University, both as a mature student. And we're going to cover a lot of ground with her background today. There might be a couple of content warnings. I will add them after this episode, just because we don't always know what we're going to cover yet. But if you feel like you need them, those will be at the top of the episode description. So I recommend checking that out just before we get into this today, because I've seen some of the notes. We want to make sure that we can still tell an authentic story, because I think that's what's most important here. But yeah, if you feel like you need the content warnings, please do check them out. But we're going to put that aside. Kelly, it's a pleasure to have you on the show today. Hello, welcome.
Hi, thank you for having me.
I have been so excited for this one myself. So for those who don't know, I'm a Laidlaw Scholarship alumni, not from LSE, but we met through the foundation putting us in touch. And I have visited you at LSE a couple times and had the best time. I've never left without food yet. I feel like I've always been fed.
Yeah, we like to look after our guests. You'll always get a good meal at LSE.
Oh, I hate to keep visiting, honestly. But so obviously I know who you are and I know the wonderful work you do. But please could you introduce yourself and share a little bit about your background in higher education?
Sure. So thank you for inviting me to talk to you today. I've been looking forward to it very much also, and I'm glad we finally found some time with our busy schedules as well. We've just had the busiest time of the year, so it's great to have some quality conversation to change the landscape slightly. So yeah, my name's Kelly Zurich. I've studied in two different places as an adult learner. But fairly recently, actually within the last 10 years, I entered higher education. So I studied education studies at University of Greenwich from 2016 to 2018. And then I studied for my master's in human rights at Kingston University from 2020 to 2023. I had to defer, that's why it took a little while longer. And that was, in both cases, part-time study whilst working, being a mum and all the other hats that I wear. So I am a mother of four, and I was diagnosed with ADHD in February 2023. And I now take medication for that, which has been a complete game changer. And I've also been told, although not officially diagnosed, that I am also autistic. And since 2022, I have unfortunately developed some intensifying chronic pain, and I've been diagnosed with fibromyalgia in December 2025, which apparently is very common in the neurodivergent community. So yeah, that's my short timeline of my experience.
That timeline is about to get much longer, I think, with what we're going to chat about next, yeah.
It is indeed.
I mean, so I think we have some common ground here, to be fair. We're both what I like to call rigorously peer-reviewed autistic, which is definitely a thing. I think you've had, it says in the notes here, 3 separate psychiatrists say that this is probably what you have. Yeah, and then I've had like psychologists come up to me and be like, yeah, no, you're autistic. And I've got family with fibromyalgia as well. That is quite the chronic pain condition. That can be incredibly taxing on anyone who isn't neurodivergent. It's a
nice, perfect storm of challenges all at once.
I hope that whatever remedial treatment you're doing is working, because I know that can not be a nice condition. Okay, we're going to get straight into the meat of this conversation today, because I know we have a lot of ground to cover, which is in some ways exciting, in some ways more important than exciting. And I think I'm going to let you just free flow through this question, because I know this is the one where we probably will have the most to cover. So I'm going to just stop speaking for a bit. But if you are comfortable saying, how did your disability, neurodivergence, and past context as well, because this is going to be a very intersectional episode. How did that impact your experience of higher education?
Brilliant, thank you. So, we had a bit of a conversation about my neurodivergent brain and struggling to be concise. And we discussed that also we need to really consider the context behind our experiences. And I think as someone who has a lot of life experience, hopefully some of this can be quite helpful to others also. So I just wanted to share a bit about my background, which feeds into some of the research that is emerging regarding neurodivergence. So I was a foster baby, and my foster parents adopted me when I was just turning 4. So one of my earliest memories is actually of being questioned in the courtroom whilst that went through. And, I'm glad that they did. I'm so lucky that they fostered me and then adopted me, because they were always mum and dad and they chose me, which is always a nice, comforting thought. My birth mother was actually a 16-year-old who had a history of addiction and lots of other life struggles. And it's only recently that I come to realise that she was undiagnosed autistic. And it's just so clear to me now that back then we didn't know about presentation in females. So, had this happened today, I think the story would have been very different. So in terms of my upbringing and my early experiences of education and life, I was one of those kids that had all sorts of labels and a very spiky profile. I was told that I was incredibly good at certain things, but honestly, the simple things, it was infuriating, the seemingly simple things that others just did so easily were always difficult. And there were these weird paradoxes, because on one hand, I seemed to have a flair for music, but I barely scraped any sight reading exams because I couldn't do music in that way, which seems to be the done way that everybody knows how to do music. I had a great memory for knowledge and facts, really struggled to articulate things and put it into words, spoken words. I use sound to learn, and I realized that music is kind of a therapy for me. It helps me to regulate, but try to tell me something to remember auditory information. My primary school teacher actually called my parents in to ask if they had had my hearing checked, because she believed that I could potentially be deaf. And it wasn't that I couldn't hear, I just couldn't process what she was saying. But again, back then, it was just either me having a physical problem or disability or condition, or it was because I was not listening, like it was a choice. So basically, I spent my whole life feeling, I call it clever stupid, and others have kind of validated that label as well in many ways, with various comments that are always said with love, but not very helpful sometimes. And I was basically raised in a world that saw my limitations. Autism and ADHD did not exist in girls when I was a kid. Spoiler alert, they did, but we didn't know about it back then. And encouragement, generally, it consisted of people telling me my limitations to lower my expectations of myself. It was a case of, you can't, rather than, if we do these things, you will be able to. So it's a very different world that we're living in now, thankfully. So as a result of that, I started life as a hairdresser, believing that was aspirational. Never really felt it was the right fit. But one thing I will say for hairdressers is that they are the least judgmental people out there. And being quirky as a hairdresser, the environment completely supports it. So, people found me innocent and charming. I just blended in. I got married very young, and, I was quite lost at that time. I didn't really know who I was. I felt faulty, yet I felt like I had more to give. And my husband just came into my life in March 2004, many years ago, giving a clue about my age now. And he played a fundamental role in helping me to realize my potential. He was the first person, and from a different culture as well. I think he had no knowledge of any of this. So he just saw me, and he played a fundamental role in helping me to realize my potential. I also, at that stage, a lot happened over those few years. I converted to Islam in the January of 2005, when we also married, did our official marriage in October 2005. And my eldest daughter, Rani, was born in December 2005, closely followed by Aya in July 2007. So by 21, I was married with 2 children. So that's kind of the background. And then in terms of how I came into higher education, obviously that wasn't the expectation, being a hairdresser, coming from a working family, and everybody's low expectation. Not low expectations, that sounds wrong, because hairdressing is actually a really difficult job, especially as an ADHD autistic person and having to master the social element. It is a very social job, which explains why maybe I found it quite demanding. But, I just wanted to do more academic stuff. I was interested, I was curious, I wanted to learn more about how the world worked. So, we were living in a council flat. We really struggled for resources financially. I learned a lot of skills. I sometimes tell my scholars when we're talking about barriers, I became the master of summing up and rounding up my grocery shop because I had no money. We had to be so careful. So, I kind of felt a bit dissatisfied. I wanted something more. And because I already had the hairdressing, I thought, well, okay, I could teach hairdressing. So I volunteered at a local college, and then I was offered a job at another college, and they put me through my teaching diploma in further education. And I enjoyed it. It was challenging. I was working with students with complex needs from difficult backgrounds. And I had a colleague, Lisa, who I admired. And this woman, it was sorcery, watching how she interacted with these students. She was just incredible. And I remember trying to be Lisa, but I didn't quite get it right. And I think now we know that that's known as mirroring, and it all makes sense. And I had the best intentions, but I just seemed to say the wrong thing. I had the wrong tone. I gave the wrong look. And no matter what I did, it just felt stressful. It was like I just couldn't get it right, even though I had the knowledge. It was the whole people element. I carried on in the role. I enjoyed it, albeit difficult. It was part-time. And then in 2012, my husband and I decided we wanted to extend our family because I had been a young mum, and it felt like the right time for us to have another child. And my son Elias was born in May 2014, and life was great. We were really happy. It just seemed great at that time. There was a large age gap between my youngest and my older 2. So I then felt like my family was incomplete. And despite my husband's objections, because he felt like 3 was a good number, we did go for number 4 from the end of 2015. So difficult experience being mentioned here. In 2016, I experienced a very traumatic miscarriage. And I won't say more than that, but it was a catalyst in many ways. And I received a staff email offering the opportunity to enroll onto a BA in education studies. And initially I did my usual thing of, oh, it'll never work because I'm not clever enough, I'm not good enough, all the echoes of the past, all of the labels, all the judgments, just there telling you all the reasons why you can't do something. And it just kept itching my brain. I couldn't make it go away. I just kept thinking about it. So I spoke to my husband, and he was really encouraging. He said, well, why can't you do it? It's a sign. It's the perfect opportunity. So I did. I signed up. And then I instantly regretted it when I got my first piece of feedback, because I don't think I realised what I was taking on.
Such a shock to the system.
It was a massive shock, and no one had ever taught me or explained to me what academic writing should be structured like. So it was learning by experience, thrown in the deep end, as they say, and sink or swim. So at that point, I decided to try and back out, and it was too late. So I was in it for the long haul. There was just no way out. So I thought, okay, we've got to make a choice here. We either coast through and just do what we're doing and hope that we pass, or we set our sights on a goal and we make it happen, despite it being really difficult. So I had an aspirational goal, which I wasn't expecting to achieve, but I thought, okay, if I can get a 2-1, that will be worthwhile, that's respectable, and that will show that I've grown and that I've achieved. Not that that means everything, because it's just an achievement, but it was something that I wanted to do for me personally, particularly with those labels in mind. I improved my second essay. I got some formative feedback. I took all that feedback on board. You know, one thing that neurodivergent people are really good at is learning by feedback generally. You know, when you know what the rules are, they're easier to follow rather than people just expecting you to know what they are. So the written feedback was still quite brutal, but I worked really hard. I learned the rules, how to play the game, so to speak, and things got better. So with my husband's help, managing the kids, I channeled everything I had, every moment, into making this work, giving it my all. My husband I should give him a name. I keep saying my husband. My husband has a name, and it is Morad. And, you know, he was my greatest fan, and he really encouraged me, which was new to me. No one had ever done that before. So, you know, he always said to me, "You've got this fire in your belly, and it's unlike anything I've ever seen." And there was something about, I think, as a 30-year-old woman in education and working and all the other things, being told that you should just settle, you know, that's what everybody's telling me. Well, it's good enough. You just need to pass. And I thought, no, I don't. It was like that fire had just exploded into this giant supernova because I just had enough of people telling me what I couldn't do. And I have this saying now that I share with my kids and with our scholars as well, where I say, you don't need to be a superhero, be a rebel. Rebel against these limitations that people are telling you are there, because they don't know, they're not real. On many occasions, I don't want to say that's the rule for everybody, but in my story that was the case.
Yeah, it's because you've also got like this radical self-acceptance, and at this point I'm jumping ahead a bit, but you're not diagnosed with ADHD at this point as well. So this is just a fire being lit up. This isn't where I've had guests on in the past where they've had a realization and then been like, oh, I've got the diagnosis, I've learned so much about myself, you know, that is good for me and I've learned a lot. It's just you going, stuff this. I could do better than that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
It's a very different take of what I normally have, but I'm so glad that you're saying all this. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, no, thank you. It's really validating to hear that, because even though I had heard of ADHD and autism, I'd looked at it in my teacher training. I was aware that it existed, but I hadn't thought for a second that it was something that might be applicable to me, because I only knew my normal. And when that's all you know, you think that everybody else works like you do. I took the position of being a rebel, being a fighter, which later down the line, I realized that I didn't need to be so feisty, because actually there were reasons why these things were difficult and why these things were happening. But at that stage, I knew nothing. And yeah, life went on. I carried on the battle, sometimes won, sometimes didn't do so well. But someone once called me a weeble. I don't know if you've ever seen those things, the little wobbly toys that bounce back up no matter how much you try to push them over.
Yeah.
I thought, you know, fair enough. I can kind of relate to that. So, yeah, I fell pregnant with Zara, my youngest, who is also autistic, and she was born in 2017, and she was a very different kind of baby. And also, we'll talk about this more later when we look at challenges, but I was still studying when I fell pregnant with Zara. And when she was born, I was writing my dissertation. So I remember in the early hours of the morning, I would have a baby in one arm and the laptop at the end of another, really multitasking to the max. So that was another level of challenge that was added in there, but, you know, a wonderful one to have, but very challenging. And at the end of it, I smashed all of these limitations and expectations, because I managed to come away with a first-class honours degree. And even to this day, it's the proudest moment of my life, because it was something that I well and truly earned, and I gave it my all. And, you know, I know there are layers of privilege within that, because I did have my husband supporting me with the kids, but it really wasn't straightforward. And it was just so great for me to think, no matter what all these other people have said about me, I've proven to myself that I am not what they say I am. And yeah, it felt really good in that moment. But the thing, as we know, with the way that we work as neurodivergent people is that these things do often come at a cost. And that's kind of what happened later on when I decided to then study for another degree with 4 children, like you do.
Typical student experience, yeah.
Yeah, you say never again when you submit your dissertation, and then about a month later, when you're over it, you're there on Google looking for what you can do next. So yeah, that's what happened. So I took a career break. Zara was a very different personality to my others, even from birth, and I just needed to give her some time. It was a new experience for me as a mum, dealing with how she was. So I did take some time out. I did some home hairdressing because I needed some income. And that was a really good thing. As much as I resented it, it taught me about what I don't want to do in life. So that was the deal breaker. It was at that point I thought, I don't want to do this anymore, and I'm not going to. So at that point, I thought, right, time for a change. Had enough now. Impulse is there. What can we do that's really radical? And then the universe decided to throw in an extra assurance just to make a point that I was on the right trajectory, and my husband faced redundancy.
Oh.
So early 2019, it was like, okay, I've got to step up here. What can I do? And I did actually get 2 job offers at once. And one of them was in a prison. And I thought, this is my calling. I felt that absolute truth in my body that this is what I need to do. And still, I'm so glad I took that role. I worked as a learning and skills manager, so in charge of prison education in a prison. And it's the toughest job I've ever done, but my goodness, did it feel like it was impactful. It aligned with my values, and it really felt like I was doing something that was meaningful and supporting. I always like to be able to support people who find things harder for whatever reason. So I learned a lot, and trying to implement change in such a huge system was quite tricky, but I did the Weevil thing. I kept fighting every day, tried my best. And then lockdown happened, which was very unpleasant when working in a prison. It was not a nice place to be. And at that point, again, I was I think the thing with being neurodivergent as well, a lot of people face a similar sort of internal battle where your body knows that something's off, but your mind hasn't quite caught up. So, my body was giving me all the signs that something wasn't okay within me. And my brain was going, no, you're fine, just carry on, just work more hours, that'll fix it. So that's what I did. I developed some horrible conditions. I became very depressed. I developed an eating disorder. I was just very, very unwell because I couldn't cope. And I couldn't access support because it was COVID. And I just had to find a way to deal with that. So I got through. I deferred my submissions to the summer submissions for my master's. I don't know if I mentioned actually within that I had enrolled onto Masters in Human Rights at Kingston University. And I had to return to work, and I just had to survive. I don't remember most of it, but I got through. And then I moved to another prison, and on day one, I was there crying in the toilet, really questioning my life choices. And I had a bit of a relapse. So it was very spiky over those couple of years. My studies were impacted. I had to defer everything, and it felt horrible inside because I felt like I'd failed. Again, not knowing that at that point I wasn't the problem. Thankfully, in 2023, I did a couple of temp jobs. I worked in the third sector. I couldn't really find my home. I was sad about leaving the prison, but it just wasn't right for me in that time with my emotional needs and with everything going on. So I met a colleague at a charity that I was working for. And again, the universe had a plan for me because she said to me, have you ever thought that maybe you might have ADHD? There were so many parallels. And all this time I've been told, oh, you're just depressed, take this pill. You're anxious, take that pill. And nothing was working. So I researched it like we do when we hear about these things, and went down a rabbit hole, and it all made sense. So I took out a loan. I paid for a private diagnosis because there was no way that I could access any NHS support in that time. And I spoke with a psychiatrist who specialised in female presentation of autism as well, and ADHD. And she said to me, like, her words were, yeah, you've got ADHD. It was just so obvious to her. And it was like, oh, okay, I'm not faulty. There is something going on here. It's just like a light shines on you and you just suddenly feel like it makes sense. It was a eureka moment. So I started taking medication and wow, considering I tried every antidepressant that ever existed and none of them ever worked, ADHD meds within a few days. I think it was the first time I ever experienced normal on any level because my brain wasn't as noisy and it just felt different. It felt like life in HD. I remember it was such a huge change. So yeah, I mean, that happened in 2023. I made it through uni. I submitted everything in the end, lots of deferrals. And eventually I came away. I got my distinction. I worked really hard. It felt bittersweet in that moment because of everything that had happened, but it was an accomplishment. And I'm glad that I did it. And, hopefully one day I might even want to go a bit further, but that's definitely not on the cards right now. So that's kind of the long story of my background and what got me to today, because I've got a lot of years behind me there in many complex and dated systems, which now thankfully have improved, although not yet ideal, but we're working on it. And in terms of my experience at university, I just think the signs were all there. I didn't get my diagnosis until towards the end of my master's in 2023. And I was constantly criticized for structure, yet no one ever actually said to me, what's going on here? Let's look at how we can implement tools to help you to structure your work. I ended up spending longer cutting my work than I did writing it. That was the bit that I really resented because I would spend days just getting that word count right. I entered a cycle of chronic burnout. I'm still struggling with that to this day because you work in spikes and then you think, yay, I've got energy, I'm fine. You spend all of that energy and more, and then you crash again. And that's probably why the fibro came into play also. And I think there's just that whole thing about your sense of self-worth, because feedback is great. I love feedback. But when it becomes personal, which I think for some people, they've not got an awareness of how to deliver objective feedback that isn't then an assault on somebody's own self-worth. So that was something that knocked me quite a bit. And it was like the typical saying of, you're playing this computer, that sounds dated. It's like a virtual reality game and it's on hard mode and everybody else has got the manual and you haven't. So it was a bit of a battle. And I think it also brought to light that I've got the experience of having less resources, which thankfully now we're in a much more privileged position. But there is also this whole thing of haves and have-nots in terms of abilities and how people perceive you.
Yeah.
And that, I think, is on par with resources, in terms of attitudes and perceptions. It was an experience that shaped me a lot, and I gained a lot and I fought a lot and I got the results. I think that it's still got some way to go. That was just my experience, obviously, a few years ago now.
Yeah. I mean, wow. I want to say, just as someone who knows you, that I'm very proud of you. And I know sometimes that's a controversial thing to say, but I didn't know that context until today, but before we started recording. And I just knew you as like Kelly, this absolute superstar. And then you obviously hear all that background and it's just like, I remember we've been chatting via email, but I met with some of your scholars at a conference at London Business School the day before we met in person. And they were just like, oh my God, you're meeting Kelly tomorrow. Like, she's the best. And like,
Aww.
Again, we'll get to it, but I wanted to let this question go on longer than I usually do, because I know that experience, and like it's a massively intersectional experience, how that has fed into not only your academic background, but your work from today. And I think that I wouldn't have it any other way if we weren't to discuss it. So obviously we've just had this big overview on everything. What I'm going to ask, just because I want to ask you about what you're doing at LSE nowadays, we're going to make some little pit stops in these questions. We're going to keep them pretty rapid fire, pretty concise, and then we should have some more time to speak about what you're doing nowadays, because I think it's incredible and worth talking about as well. But we'll get through these first. So we've obviously spoken about the big picture of you being a student in higher education. I was wondering, as a mature student, what your experience was accessing higher education from a disability standpoint, though I am aware that you were undiagnosed until halfway through your master's. But if you have anything to add there, then go for it.
In my undergrad, I had no diagnoses, very high masking at that point in life. But certainly for my master's, I had other diagnoses that preceded the ADHD diagnosis, which I did raise, and obviously got the deferrals with the medical evidence and everything, so that it was all within the processes for that. So I guess I don't have a huge amount to say about this because of the limited experience, but I would say there is a lot of bureaucracy. It's very much, it's a process. I don't want to say a tick box exercise because they had the best intentions, but the framing wasn't really in line with a needs-based model. It was more to do with a medical model. And that, when you're newly diagnosed with things, isn't very helpful because you're still learning and you don't really know what you need. You don't know what you can ask for. So it just felt a bit like, I had to submit my report and I redacted very personal parts of it, but it still felt like a very vulnerable thing to be sending to a functional mailbox to make sure that it was logged officially. So I think that sometimes the processes have to be there for fairness, absolutely, but perhaps there are ways in which they could make it feel a bit safer and a bit more human. And I think that is happening today. I think that work is taking place. And obviously, this is a different institution, but as a mature student, I think that there's less focus on that. I think that because you're part-time, because you're not engaging with the entire student life element, and you're not sort of in the societies and you're not living near campus, I think there's just this assumption that, well, you're an adult, you're a mature adult, you know what you need, and you just need to kind of turn up when timetabled and do the work, and it's kind of simplified in that sense, and the expectations are different as opposed to if you were a full-time student with the whole university life.
Yeah,
I mean, the things that seem simple were often dismissed unintentionally, but it does happen sometimes.
And I think that it's important to note because sometimes it's not just the intersections in your background, it's also where you might meet not unconventional, but not the standard like full-time go to uni at 18 undergraduate experience. Sometimes just because they want to cater to the biggest demographics by default, sometimes universities will accidentally not consider those learners. And I think it's just having that rounded awareness really that's just will go a long way and is so important. So obviously we've already covered that university was a very, say, interesting time for you because you had a lot of this personal achievement, but you were balancing family and sometimes painful experiences. And sometimes we know, especially with undiagnosed neurodivergent students or neurodivergent students with a new diagnosis, there can be obstacles there in addition to just life. So I was just wondering, did you encounter any other obstacles relating to your studies? Did you manage to navigate them? And if so, how?
I think that a lot of it varies depending on what level of study you're engaging with. But I think in both instances, I would say that some delivery styles were incompatible with how I learn. And they tend to adopt a much more convergent thinking model where there is a right and a wrong answer. And my mind just doesn't work like that. I want to know the why. I want to understand the broader landscape. I want to know the possibilities. I want to understand the context and the journey. So it seemed like an annoyance at times when I would ask those questions because, if you don't need to know it, if it's not part of the curriculum, why would we waste time discussing those things and those intricacies and the creative side of it? So not all the time, but with specific lectures and topics, I found that kind of demotivated me a little bit. because I think my curiosity is my driving force. I want to understand, I want to learn more, I want to expand, which it didn't really invite me to do. In terms of undergrad specific, I think what would have really helped would have been if someone could help me to channel my focus. I have great difficulty in understanding what is relevant and what isn't, because in my mind, everything is important. All the details matter. And that kind of got me into this difficult place where cutting to the word count and working within those parameters took so much time because I had no framework to help me to identify what was important and what wasn't. And, maybe someone once said to me, just pick one part of it. They're not expecting you to answer the entire question. Well, I didn't know that. You asked me a question, I'm going to answer it. I think your question is wrong, not my answer.
Here's my rabbit hole for like 7 hours on Google. You're going to have this.
Yeah, exactly. So, it's just that wasn't really factored into the design. But again, that was the undergrad, that was in 2016. So maybe it was in its infancy then, and hopefully it's better now. But in terms of the postgrad, I think the main thing for me was the feedback. My first year was actually much better. And I think that's because I had human rights specialists delivering the curriculum. And one of them, I just clicked. I think he was neurodivergent himself, undiagnosed. And I just clicked with him. And I thought, yes, you are exactly the kind of energy and the kind of person that we need in this. And he really drove my passion for human rights. And he got me exploring, where my real kind of niche areas were within that. And I liked his style. He would tell me things exactly as he meant them without a filter. And that was really valuable to me because I don't understand it. I mean, some people might say it's a arguably British thing with our style where we kind of feel like we need to soften everything. And that's just noise and stuff to me. It doesn't help me. So I really valued his approach with that. And unfortunately, he left halfway through my course. Oh. And I was then filled into an international relations class. And I feel like that's where things came a bit unstuck because I couldn't understand what was relevant to me. It felt very generic. It was stuff that I'm never going to pursue in terms of particular international hot topics. And it just kind of demotivated me a bit. And I thought, well, the advice that I was getting, the feedback I was getting wasn't specific to human rights. And that was kind of frustrating and a bit of a barrier in a way. And the lesson content, it just became difficult.
So I know that you had this massive intersectional experience. You also had adjustments teams that reached out, but they couldn't really give you resources for ADHD, which, I wanted to give you the room to say we're just cut for time, so I hope I did that justice by reading the notes. But, it was struggling to access meaningful support on top of what's already quite a complex experience for you as a part-time mature student with children and, a lot going on.
Yeah.
And I was just wondering, super, super quickly, do you think that intersectional experience, or how did that intersectional experience shape how you show up in higher education? Do you think that's really, I assume it's part of who you are, so I feel like, do you think it has, as maybe a redundancy, but maybe how has that intersectional experience shaped how you show up in higher education nowadays where you're doing a lot of student-facing work?
Yeah, I think I really see the nuances, and I think that I have a lot of empathy also, having the lived experience, having encountered so many barriers. It makes you a great problem solver. There is no problem too big, but I get it. I get that everybody's story is different. Everybody's needs are different. I don't really care what the web page says in terms of how to support a student with ADHD. That's not going to be my first resource. My first resource is going to be having a conversation with that person to find out who they are, where their challenges are, and what they need that is meaningful, that is going to support their experience and enable that sort of the bridging of the gap that would otherwise be there if they didn't have that support, if others have those advantages.
Yeah, and I've seen the work that you do firsthand. I said I've met some of your scholars. Shout out to Sophia, actually. Absolutely lovely people. And I got the privilege to come and see some of them graduate from the scholarship at LSE a couple months ago, and you could see how much the work that you and your team do like means to them. I remember you made a video for them on the last night before they graduated. You were like, I've been up until 12. Have I slept?
This is more important.
Do you know what though? They loved it, and you could see the amount of care that went into it. I think you slept for like 13 hours after that, which is like so well deserved. But honestly, you've gone from starting uni at 30 to now working in a university and doing this amazing work at LSE. And I was just wondering, in a couple of sentences, could you introduce your current work and what you're doing to the listeners in a little more detail?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, shout out to the scholars also. They are incredible people, and I just feel so privileged to be working with them. And, you know, we've got a community going on. And I think the Laidlaw programme itself, the Laidlaw Scholars programme, it promotes that community anyway, and it creates it in the many different ways that it works. But also, I think it's really important when you're in this new world and you're away from home and it's change and it's different, you've got to navigate it. I just felt that I needed to do something that was shaped by scholars. I wanted to make sure that it was bottom up, it was meaningful, it was helpful, it was what they wanted. And I'm very open to being wrong. I keep saying to them, give me feedback. Things are changing. Every individual is different. The programme is amazing, and there are so many different areas that we focus on that all build into this whole skills profile and character development that is going to help all through life. But then I think, where do I feature within that? Well, I need to make sure that they've got everything they need. I am there to serve them, and that's what I strive to do. I just want to make sure that they know that they've got someone that they can ask for what they need. They know it's a safe space. They know there's no judgment. And it's not a privilege for them to get what they need. It is an absolute right.
That might be the tagline for your episode. And again, like, I know the scholars adore what you do. Like, so for context, the Laidlaw Scholarship is a 2-year program it's slightly different from when I did it in COVID, and it varies by university. And I wasn't at LSE, but it was intensive leadership training, 1 summer abroad, 1 summer of research. The summer abroad is either, I think you do your research abroad, don't you, at LSE?
Yes. A group research. Yeah.
And then social action back in the UK, that varies by uni, but it's intensive, and they do need that support, and they're managing it with studies. Like, they're working on Saturdays doing these workshops, and you're facilitating those as well. It's an intensive program, and they need people like you at that level of empathy and, you know, the time that you can give to them. And I think it really does mean a lot. I'm gonna have to rapid fire you now though, lovely. Sorry.
Yeah, sure.
We got into this wonderful flow. And I mean, you've kind of already answered this question, but I guess in a rapid form. How do you use your experience of disability and neurodivergence to aid in the personal and professional development of the students and scholars you work with? Because, you know, they're wonderful people.
Yeah, and I think there is a simple answer to this one for me, and whether I'm getting it right is another thing. I hope I'm getting it partially right, but I feel inspired by the words of Brené Brown talking about vulnerability. I think it's important to be able to give people permission to bring their vulnerability into the room, to be authentic, to not have to perform. And I think that through a disability lens, I think that helps. I think that's the right way to do it.
Yeah, and it's a matter of, I guess, because a lot of the scholars will be striving for that academic excellence, and it's getting them to, you know, what they might believe is this kind of pinnacle for them at this point of their lives, then being like, actually, we're not going to make you a perfectionist. That's not how we want to push you. You know, there's a healthy way to do this. You just don't know it exists.
Yeah, new way of doing things.
Yeah, and that's quite rare in higher education, and I think it's a real strength, which feeds, luckily, very well into the next question. It's a question I ask all my guests. No is a valid answer. Have you experienced any instances of your disability neurodivergence proving helpful in a higher education setting?
I think yes, in terms of what I'm doing now. I think that if I didn't have the life experience, I wouldn't be able to niche support and I don't want to sound like I'm blowing my own trumpet here because other people do these things, right? But I think that my lived experience and the barriers that I face, I'm really keen to remove those for others. So I think if I didn't have that experience, I wouldn't be aware of it because no one does it intentionally. It's just that if you don't know, how do you act on it? So, yeah, I think that's the main thing, that I'm grateful in that way, that I have that and I can kind of use it for a better purpose than my own experience.
Yeah, because I mean, the important thing, I guess, is to remember that we can't erase lived experience that's already happened, but we can help people take that next step. And I think that's something you've really kind of realized on a profound level, and really running with that sounds like it brings a lot to your work and what you do nowadays.
I hope so.
Yeah.
The scholars will tell you.
Well, everyone I've spoken to thinks you're absolutely wonderful. And so I was wondering, you're a rebel, as I'm sure you encourage yourself to be. And I know that sometimes means you go against the grain in some of your practices. And I was wondering, what is one change you'd like to see in the sector which would make things more inclusive for staff and or students, whatever your gut instinct's telling you? This can be, sector-wide if you have any thoughts about it.
One thing, one magic ingredient. I'm going to go back to the bottom-up approach, the needs-based approach. And I'm going to say that, and this is happening, it's going in the right direction, but allowing students to access accommodations and reasonable adjustments and adaptations based on their own needs, not based on a diagnosis or an official headed piece of paper that has specific words on it. I think I would like to see that more broadly. Again, I understand why it's needed. I do get that, but I think that there's maybe a better way of doing it that allows for those that either don't have the diagnosis or choose not to get the diagnosis, which is totally valid, to still be able to access the accommodations to support their journey.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I agree it is getting better, but you can also see how much support can be lost, especially because, say, disabled students allowance requires a formal diagnosis, and sometimes that is like you get a lot from that and you gain a lot, and it's, how do we do that for people and how do we get it right?
Yeah.
And we're gonna have to close there, unfortunately. I wish I could give us more time, but I only have so much time to edit these episodes. And I think we've covered a lot of ground today. I think a lot that we can consider about students from less common backgrounds, and people will have other things going on in their lives, and there's a lot of things to consider, I feel like. And we've learned about you and your story, and it's been such an honor. Thank you for coming with such a raw experience to the show. I know sometimes that isn't easy, and I really, really do appreciate it. And I also think that it's a good time, I think, if we leave it there, because we have so many points to reflect on. I don't want to overload anyone. So much to reflect on. But I am going to ask you this final question, because it's a nice little bow to tie on this. What is one key takeaway you would like listeners to remember from your story, in a couple of sentences if you can? I'm aware the notes are a bit longer.
Okay, so I was thinking about the purpose of speaking today, and what your why is also in the work that you do. And I grew up in a world where there is this implicit expectation to filter our words and our stories. And I just thought, I can share my story. I'm not ashamed of what's happened. I appreciate the benefits within everything that's happened. And I think there are opportunities. So I just wanted to share it openly, unfiltered. And I hope that this might invite others to do the same, because in our community, we can support each other. And it's really important that we remove the shame and we help with the awareness more broadly within the neurotypical community as well, to make sure that shame is it becomes a thing of the past. So thank you so much for inviting me to do that today. It's really been a pleasure.
Oh, no, it's been my pleasure. Thank you so much. And one thing that I feel incredibly honoured to do, actually, like making the connection in my head, is I've had you on the show this week, but even last week's guest, Alicia, has done a lot of work into removing shame. You know, they've been sectioned multiple times and they use it to inform their lived experience. They use their lived experience to inform their practice in their bachelor's degree. And I think that having such a, I hate using the word inspiring because I know that it comes from a place of such hardship, but hearing these stories that you don't usually hear, and that, you know, they want to remove the shame from their backgrounds and make it into a new, more powerful thing for them, almost as something which can be leveraged to help others. I think it's made you actually quite a profound pairing of guests, and I hope that, you know, if people have just come to listen to you, they can go back and listen to Alicia's episode as well, because I think you both actually make such an amazing pair in consecutive episodes. So yeah, thank you so much for coming on. Let me just close up this show. So HE Enabled is the show dedicated to sharing our experiences of disability, neurodivergence and long-term health conditions in UK higher education. If you are listening to this before what would be the 26th of April, that means you are a patron. Thank you so much for listening to the show and supporting it. If you want to be a patron and you are not, there will be a link in the episode description where you can join. It's only £1 a month. I sometimes put nature photography there, sometimes early episodes. It would be great to have you. And if you want to contribute to the show but you can't contribute monthly for whatever reason, that is okay. If you want to just do a one-time payment, there is a buy me a coffee link in the episode description as well. And other than that, Kelly, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.